All right, so today we're going to be diving into a concept that always seems to stir up some serious debate: secession. When a region is like, okay, we're done, we're out of here, starting our own country. We've got some excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on Secession to guide us, and trust me, this is going to be a wild ride.
It's a topic that never really goes away, does it? I mean, look around the world and you'll see secessionist movements popping up everywhere, each one with its own unique set of arguments and reasons.
Exactly. It's definitely a hot topic. So before we go full-on philosophy nerd, I was thinking maybe we could start with a real-world example, just to ground our discussion a bit. How about Scotland? They had that referendum back in 2014 on independence. And even though they voted to stay with the UK, the whole debate is far from over.
Oh, Scotland is a brilliant example. It really highlights all those tangled up questions like national identity. Can they make it on their own? Economically, historical stuff, grievances, and of course the whole democracy and self-determination thing.
So using Scotland as let's say, our case study here, let's define secession. I mean, it might seem obvious, but there are other ways for a state to break apart.
Right. Secession is specifically when a group within a country says, we're out,
Hmm.
and tries to form a brand new independent state on like a chunk of that original territory. They're not trying to join another country. They want complete independence, making the original state smaller.
Okay, so like when Germany unified, that wasn't secession. It was East Germany basically saying, hey, we want to be part of West Germany.
You got it. Or think about Czechoslovakia. They peacefully split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. That's different too. Or when outside forces, like, historically break up a country, like what happened to Poland?
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So we've got secession defined. Now, for the philosophers out there, and this goes back to Scotland, the big question is, when is secession morally justified?
And this is where things get really interesting. Philosophers like to separate being morally justified from having a right to actually do it. They aren't always the same.
So just because a group makes a convincing case for independence, that doesn't mean they automatically have the legal or political right to just leave.
Exactly. It's like you might be able to justify, say, eating an entire pizza yourself if you're starving. But it doesn't mean you have the right to do that if the pizza belongs to somebody else.
Okay, I like that analogy. Makes it easy to digest. So Scotland might argue they'd be better off running their own show. But that doesn't necessarily mean they have a right to just walk away from the UK.
Exactly. This difference is super important because it helps us understand why real-world secessionist movements are so complex. It's not just do they have a good reason, it's also who gets to decide and what are others obligated to do about it.
So let's say, just for the sake of argument, that Scotland does have a strong moral case. Does that automatically mean they'd be okay using force to get what they want?
Now you're venturing into just war theory territory, which adds a whole nother layer of ethics. We'll definitely come back to that later. But for now, let's focus on the moral side of secession itself.
Sounds good. So the Stanford Encyclopedia, they lay out a whole bunch of different theories. But a key difference they make is between remedial right-only theories and primary right theories. Can you break those down for us?
Sure, remedial right-only theories, they see secession as a last resort, like a way to fix a huge injustice. Kind of like the right to revolution, you only get to use it when the state has seriously wronged a group.
So Scotland would have to show that the UK is actively harming them in some way to justify leaving.
Precisely. And it has to go beyond just disagreeing with some policies. We're talking about things like systematic discrimination, oppression, denying people basic freedoms. Serious stuff.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about when a group wants independence? Not because they're being harmed, but because they just have a different vision for their future. Like maybe they feel their culture and values are being ignored or not respected within the existing state. Do those aspirations have any moral weight at all?
That's where these primary right theories come in. They say the right to secede exists even without some big injustice happening. It's about a fundamental right to self-determination, independent of any wrongdoings.
So for Scotland, even if the UK wasn't mistreating them, they could still argue they have a right to govern themselves based on their distinct national identity, their hopes and dreams for the future.
You got it. And here's where it gets even more interesting, because within primary right theories, there are two main branches, plebiscitary and ascriptivist.
All right, let's take those one by one. What about these plebiscitary theories? They sound a bit ancient Roman-like emperors giving a thumbs up or down.
Well, without the gladiators and togas, it's not a terrible comparison. Plebiscitary theories argue that if a clear majority in a region votes to secede, like in a referendum, and they can create a viable state, then they have a right to do it, regardless of their reasons.
So it's almost like a political divorce, but with a bit more at stake than who gets the dog.
Huh, exactly. But it can get kind of counterintuitive. One of the big thinkers on this, Christopher Wellman, he actually says secession might be okay even if there's no active injustice happening.
Hold on, so even if a group is treated fairly in their current state, they could still be allowed to leave just because they want to?
According to Wellman, yeah. He sees self-determination as this fundamental right. So if a group can prove they can govern themselves well and build a viable state, then they should get to go their own way.
Now that's a pretty radical idea. It goes against the whole thing about secession being a response to oppression.
It definitely shakes things up, doesn't it? And naturally, it raises a bunch of questions and potential issues, which we'll get into, of course.
Like, wouldn't this just lead to chaos? Every little group could just up and declare independence.
That's the domino effect worry a lot of people have. But Wellman argues that his theory has some built-in breaks. First, there's the whole viable state thing. Creating a functioning government that lasts. That's not easy. It's not just drawing lines on a map. It takes resources, institutions, and honestly, the will to make it work.
So you can't just want independence. You got to show you can actually handle it.
Exactly. And Wellman is really clear about the importance of a solid majority vote. Not just a small, unhappy faction making trouble. It's got to be a genuine expression of what the people want.
Okay, so there are safeguards to keep things from getting too crazy. But what about the economic side of things? What if a rich region votes to secede, leaving the poorer parts to struggle?
That's the haves versus have-nots problem. And it's a valid concern. Wellman tries to address this by saying that the group that's leaving, they have a responsibility to make sure the remaining state can still function. So things like negotiating how to share resources or maybe providing some economic help during the transition.
So it's not just a see ya, wouldn't want to be ya kind of thing. It's got to be done responsibly.
Right. But even with these safeguards, this plebiscitary approach has its critics. Some say it gives too much power to a simple majority vote, even if the reasoning behind the vote is flawed.
Which brings us back to Scotland, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even if a majority voted for independence, you'd still need to ask why. Were there reasons based on a true desire to govern themselves? Or was it more about, anxieties about the economy or maybe even nationalism?
Exactly. And it gets even more complicated because even if we agree that a majority vote can justify secession, we still got to figure out the whole issue of land rights.
Because it's not just about the people, it's about the actual land, right?
Yeah.
Because who gets to claim that piece of the earth with all its history and resources?
Things get sticky there. A seceding group like Scotland, they'd need to show they're not only capable of governing, but they have stronger rights to occupy that land. They'd need to prove that the territory is essential to their way of life, their culture, in a way that it isn't for the rest of the UK.
It's like saying it's not just some random property, it's a part of who we are as a people.
Exactly. And that brings us to some massive questions in political philosophy. What gives a state a valid claim to land in the first place? What about historical injustices like conquest or colonization? How do those factor in? And how do we balance the rights of the people living there now versus potential claims from those who might have been displaced in the past?
Wow, so we started with, when can a group secede? And now we're deep in philosophical debates about land and history.
That's the beauty of this topic. It forces us to grapple with how we organize societies, the relationship between individuals and states, and what we owe each other across generations.
A lot to think about, for sure. But it feels like we're just getting started. We only touched on plebiscitary theories and haven't even gotten to ascriptivist ones yet.
Buckle up. Ascriptivist theories take us right into the heart of national identity. This idea that distinct peoples, they have a right to self-determination simply because of who they are. So with these ascriptivist theories, we're really getting into the idea that certain groups, often defined by things like their nationality or ethnicity or shared culture, they have this inherent right to govern themselves. It's not just about a majority vote, it's about acknowledging the specific claims of certain groups, even if they're not the majority in a region.
So it's like saying our people have lived on this land forever. It's part of who we are, so we have a fundamental right to make our own decisions here. Is that the gist?
You got it. It's a kind of collective right tied to a group's history, who they are. It resonates with arguments for indigenous self-determination, where a group's connection to a specific land gives them a special claim to sovereignty.
That makes sense. But wouldn't this approach, if it's taken too far, lead to just endless fragmentation? Every small cultural or linguistic group could demand their own state.
Yeah, that's the big worry, right? Potential for chaos, instability. If every group with a slightly different identity starts claiming a right to secede, critics wonder, how could you even govern in such a fragmented world?
And what happens when you've got multiple groups claiming the same territory? Sounds like a recipe for conflict.
Absolutely, it's a huge challenge. How do you fairly decide between those competing claims, especially in areas with, complicated histories of migration, overlapping cultures, changing borders? It gets really messy, really fast.
So it's not as easy as saying you have a distinct identity, so bam, you get your own state.
Yeah.
You've got to consider all the real-world consequences,
Yeah.
potential conflicts.
Exactly. And ascriptivist theorists, they do acknowledge these problems. Some suggest that even though distinct groups might have this inherent right to secede, there could be other things that override that right, like the need to prevent widespread instability, or to make sure the rights of minorities, even within those groups, are protected.
So it's a balancing act, recognizing the right to self-determination, but also the need for some stability and making sure everyone's rights are protected.
Right, a real balancing act.
Yeah.
And no simple formula. Now, philosopher David Miller, he kind of leans towards this view. He says we need to be careful about our justification. Are we saying nations need their own states, or are we saying states need to only have one nation within them? Two different things.
Okay, I'm following. So first, why would a nation, as opposed to just any group, need its own state?
Well, one argument is protection. States can protect a nation's culture and identity. Without that, they might get absorbed, dominated by bigger, more powerful groups. Their whole way of life could be threatened.
Like a safe space where they can keep their traditions alive, free from outside pressure.
Exactly. And another argument is about obligations. Some ascriptivist thinkers believe that people within a nation, they have special duties to each other, duties that can only really be fulfilled within a shared state.
Kind of like a family. You have a stronger obligation to care for your family than you do for strangers. A shared national identity might create that same kind of feeling of responsibility.
Precisely. But even with these arguments, it's not a slam dunk. I mean, look around. You see plenty of examples where nations maintain their culture just fine within bigger, more diverse states. French Canadians in Canada, or all the indigenous groups that keep their cultural practices alive within larger countries.
That's true. It suggests maybe having your own state isn't the only way to protect a nation's identity.
Right. Now, the other side of Miller's point, this idea that states should only be made up of one nation, that's where things get a bit more controversial.
Why would a state need to be so homogenous? Just one nation. Seems like that would exclude a lot of people, go against the whole idea of diversity.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. One classic argument going all the way back to John Stuart Mill is that true democracy, it can only really work in a mononational state. The idea is that having a shared identity, it creates unity, trust, and that's essential for making democratic decisions together.
So, if we all agree on who we are and what we value, we're more likely to work together on how to govern ourselves.
Right. Without that, democracy could just turn into constant conflict. Different groups fighting for power, never finding any common ground. But of course, critics point out that this is too simple.
I mean, plenty of diverse, multi-ethnic democracies seem to do just fine. Look at Canada, Switzerland. They have multiple languages, cultures, all within their borders.
Exactly. And trying to force mononationalism can lead to really bad policies, trying to assimilate people, exclude those who don't fit in, a dangerous path.
It's the dark side of nationalism, right?
Yeah.
The idea that you need purity, homogeneity for a strong state.
Hmm.
But history shows us that diversity can be a strength, not a weakness.
Absolutely. Now, another argument for mononational states is distributive justice. The thinking is, if you have a strong shared identity, people are more willing to share, to make sacrifices for the common good.
The we're all in this together kind of mentality.
Mm-hmm.
You see everyone as part of your extended family, so you're more likely to help out when things get tough.
Right. But again, there are counter-arguments. We see people across national borders showing solidarity, compassion all the time, and nationalism can just as easily be twisted to justify hoarding resources and excluding outsiders.
So it's a double-edged sword. National identity can bring people together, but it can also be used to divide and exclude.
Exactly. This ascriptivist approach, it raises a lot of questions about identity, the relationship between nations and states, and the good and bad that can come from strong national feelings. It's a lot to unpack.
It really is, and I think it just shows how important it is to look beyond the simple slogans and really dig into the nuances of these issues. Secession, it's never a straightforward process.
Well said. And just to add another layer of complexity here, all of these theories of secession, whether they're about fixing injustice or asserting some kind of primary right, whether they focus on votes or group identity, they all have to be considered within the bigger picture of territorial justice.
Because at the end of the day, secession is about claiming a physical piece of land with all its history and baggage.
Exactly. So any theory of secession that's worth anything has to answer some tough questions. What makes a state's claim to a specific territory legit in the first place? How do we account for historical injustices like conquest or colonization? And how do we balance the rights of the people living there now with potential claims from people who were maybe displaced in the past?
It's like untangling a family property dispute that goes back generations. So many layers of history and competing claims.
Perfect analogy. This is where theory meets reality. If the theory of secession can't deal with all the complexities of territorial justice, it's just not going to work in the real world.
Like building a house on a shaky foundation. It might look good at first, but it's not going to last.
You got it. And this leads us to another crucial aspect of the secession debate, that we can't ignore the connection to just war theory.
Ah, yes, the big question. Because let's be honest, secession rarely happens peacefully. There's often violence, which brings up a ton of ethical problems.
Exactly. It's not just about whether a group has a right to secede, it's also about whether they're justified in using force to get their independence. And on the other side, if a state rejects a group's claim to secede, does that give them the right to use force to keep their territory? It's a real ethical minefield.
So even if a group thinks they have a legitimate right to secede, that doesn't automatically mean they can go to war.
Exactly. Just war theory sets a very high bar for justifying using force. You need things like a just cause, right intention, proportionality, and a reasonable chance of success.
So simply wanting independence, even if you have good reasons, wouldn't automatically meet those criteria.
Right. And on the other side, even if a state thinks it has a right to hold on to its territory, that doesn't mean they can use any means necessary to put down a secessionist movement.
So there are limits on both sides. It's about finding that balance between self-determination and peaceful conflict resolution.
Exactly. And that's where understanding just war theory can be really helpful in figuring out these secessionist conflicts. It provides a framework for thinking about the ethics of war, the limits of violence.
Making sure the pursuit of independence doesn't come at the cost of basic human rights and international law. Because secession isn't just a domestic issue, it affects the whole global order, how states relate to each other.
Absolutely. And speaking of international law, that's another key piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit. How does international law deal with secession? Are there clear rules?
Here's the tricky thing. International law is actually really vague when it comes to secession. There's no clear right to secede spelled out in treaties or customary law.
So it's a bit of a legal gray area, open to interpretation. That doesn't sound very helpful for groups wanting independence or states trying to hold on to their territory.
It definitely creates uncertainty. International law does recognize a right to self-determination for all peoples, but that's often interpreted as applying mainly to colonial situations, like the decolonization movements in Africa and Asia in the 20th century.
So granting independence to colonies, not about letting any group within a state break away. There's a difference.
Right. And this limited application of self-determination causes tension and frustration, especially for groups who feel their desire for independence is just as valid as those former colonies. It's like, hey, how come they get to be free, but we don't?
It's like saying you can only leave the club if you were forced to join in the first place.
Yeah, good way to put it. And that's where all this philosophical work on secession can be really useful. By looking at the different moral arguments, we can start to develop better, more principled approaches to international law, a system that takes into account all the complexities of self-determination in the 21st century.
Bridging the gap between the ideas and the reality of international politics.
Exactly. One big question is, should international law just recognize a right to secede? Or should it separate the right to secede from the right to be recognized as a legitimate state?
Okay, now there's a subtle difference there. What's the practical impact?
Imagine a group that clearly fits the criteria for justifiable secession, right? they've suffered human rights abuses, or they have a really strong claim to self-determination. Under the first option, international law would simply acknowledge their right to form their own state with all the benefits that come with it.
So they get welcomed into the club, with all the perks of a recognized nation.
Exactly. But under the second option, international law would separate the act of secession, breaking away and governing themselves, from being recognized as a legitimate state. And that recognition brings a lot of benefits.
So it's like saying, you can do your own thing, but we're not necessarily giving you our stamp of approval.
Right. This distinction lets the international community set some conditions for recognition. Things like being committed to democracy, human rights, being peaceful with your neighbors.
Like a trial period for new states. They have to prove they can handle being independent before they're fully accepted.
Exactly. It's like acknowledging that just granting independence isn't always enough. New states often face huge challenges, and the international community can help them build stable, just societies.
It's like saying self-determination is an ongoing process, not just a one-time event. It takes time, support, to really become a functioning, responsible member of the global community.
Well said. And it highlights something important. Philosophy isn't always about finding the one right answer. It's often about understanding how complex an issue is and helping us ask better questions.
So it's not about a magic formula for solving the secession puzzle. It's about understanding the different values and principles and using that to make more informed decisions.
Exactly. And that's where philosophy is so valuable. Even if it doesn't give us a set of rules to follow, it helps us have better conversations about real secessionist movements, understand the different viewpoints, and think about what might happen with different actions.
It's about going beyond the simple sound bites and really thinking about self-determination in a complicated, diverse world.
Well said. And this brings us to another interesting layer in this debate. The idea that the right to secede might actually be institution dependent.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What does it mean for a right to be institution dependent?
Well, it means whether a group has a right to secede, it might actually hinge on the specific institutions in place at different levels, like local, regional, national, international.
So it's not just abstract ideas, it's about how societies are actually structured and governed.
Exactly. For example, a group might have a stronger argument for secession if the current state is very centralized and ignores their needs. But a group within a more decentralized democratic system might have less justification for leaving.
It's like if you already have a voice in how you're governed, you're less likely to want to go your own way.
Exactly. And thinking about institutions can help us understand the role that international organizations can play in these secessionist situations.
Because in today's world, secession is rarely just between a state and a group that wants to leave. You often have other countries, regional groups, the UN, all involved.
Absolutely. And these international actors can be really important. They can help mediate disputes, provide humanitarian aid, and generally help make sure that if secession does happen, it happens as peacefully and fairly as possible.
So self-determination isn't just about rights, it's also about responsibilities. States have a responsibility to respect their people's aspirations, and the international community has a responsibility to support peaceful and just solutions to conflicts.
Well said. And this leads to an important point. No single theory of secession is perfect. They each have their pros and cons, their blind spots.
So it's not about finding the one right answer, but understanding the nuances of each theory and recognizing that different situations might need different approaches.
Precisely. And that's where philosophy helps. It makes us think about tough questions, challenge our assumptions, and consider the ethics of our choices.
It's about using our brains to navigate the real world and work towards a better future.
Well said. And this brings us to another often overlooked question. How do we know a group's desire to secede really reflects what the people want?
Oh, that's a great point. We've talked about rights and justifications, but
Yeah.
not really about authenticity. How do we know the decision to secede is genuine and not manipulated or coerced?
Exactly. It's about making sure the process is truly democratic and representative. And that raises practical questions. How do you know for sure if a group really wants to secede? What kind of majority do you need? And how do you protect the voices of those who don't want to secede?
Because even in a democracy, sometimes the majority can overrule the rights of minorities.
Absolutely. So any good theory of secession has to address this. Make sure self-determination doesn't undermine basic democratic values.
And this brings up another important question we haven't really talked about. What about the rights of those who don't want to secede?
That's crucial. Secession isn't just about the group that wants independence, it's also about those who want to stay part of the original state, or those who get caught in the middle.
Like a family going through a divorce.
Yeah.
Even if the parents agree to split, you still have to think about the kids.
Exactly. So any theory of secession needs to address this. Should those who oppose secession get dual citizenship? Should they be compensated for any losses? How do you guarantee they won't face discrimination in the new state?
It's about making sure the pursuit of self-determination for one group doesn't trample on the rights and freedoms of others.
Well said. And all these questions about individual rights remind us that this secession debate is connected to bigger discussions about human rights, minority rights, and the responsibility of states to protect everyone, regardless of their political views.
Even in times of change, we can't forget those basic principles of human dignity.
Absolutely. Now, considering all this territorial justice, just war theory, international law, individual rights, we clearly need a nuanced approach to this whole secession debate.
It's not about finding a one-size-fits-all solution. It's about understanding each case and applying these philosophical tools in a way that promotes both self-determination and justice.
Exactly. And that's what makes philosophy so valuable. It pushes us to ask tough questions, challenge what we think we know, and consider the ethics of our actions.
It's about using our intelligence to navigate the real world and work towards a more just and peaceful future.
Well said. And this leads us to a final and perhaps most crucial question. Given all the complexities we've explored, what do you think the future of secession looks like in a world increasingly shaped by globalization and all these different claims to self-determination? It's a question that'll keep us all debating for years to come.
Yeah, it's amazing how much there is to think about with this whole secession thing. Feels like we've barely scratched the surface.
It really is a lot to take in, isn't it? And I think it reminds us that philosophy isn't always about neat and tidy answers. It's about grappling with these big, complicated questions and coming to a better understanding of what's at stake.
And with secession, the stakes are huge. We're talking about the very foundations of states, the rights of individuals and groups, the possibility of conflict, but also cooperation on a global level.
Absolutely. And as we've seen, there's just no single answer to the question of when secession is justified. It all depends on history, political systems, cultural identities, the economy, and of course, the ethical principles that we think are most important.
It's like a puzzle where the pieces keep changing shape as you're trying to put them together.
Great analogy. And it shows how important it is to have these discussions, to think about the different philosophical viewpoints, and to question our own assumptions.
Because we have to wrestle with this complexity if we want to deal with real-world secession in a way that's fair and keeps things stable.
Right. And it brings us back to that big question about the future of secession in a world that's more interconnected and diverse than ever. I think the old ideas about statehood and sovereignty, they're being challenged in some really fundamental ways.
This idea of fixed borders, it seems kind of outdated in this age of globalization, mass migration, and all these different identities.
Exactly. And while I don't think secession is going away, I think we need to rethink how we approach it to fit these new realities.
So what could that look like? What are some ways forward that can help us face these challenges more fairly and sustainably?
Well, I think we need to move beyond these simple either ideas. The idea that every secessionist movement is either all good or all bad, that states are always right to oppose secession, or that self-determination is the only thing that matters.
It's about recognizing that people have different aspirations, understanding historical grievances, and being open to creative solutions that might not fit into the old categories.
Right, and this means being willing to have real dialogue between states and secessionist movements, between different cultural and ethnic groups, and between the global community and those who are fighting for self-determination.
Creating spaces where people can have honest conversations, listen to each other, and find common ground, even when they disagree.
Absolutely. And we also need to rethink the role of these international institutions. Maybe we need new ways to settle disputes, to make sure minority rights are protected, to help with peaceful transitions, and to support new states that are forming.
It's about recognizing that self-determination isn't a winner-take-all game. It's a process that needs cooperation, compromise, and finding solutions that work for everyone involved.
Exactly. And in the end, I think that by focusing on dialogue, understanding, and creative problem solving, we can move towards a future where secession, if it happens, actually helps the cause of justice and human well-being instead of hurting it.
That's a goal worth working towards. And it reminds us that philosophy, when it's done right, isn't just some intellectual game. It's a way to understand and shape the world we live in.
Exactly. And even if we don't have all the answers, Just having these tough conversations, wrestling with these complicated questions is a good start.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to wrap up. A reminder that we never stop learning and understanding. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. It's been a really thought-provoking deep dive.
The pleasure was all mine. And thank you for leading such an engaging discussion.
And to all you listening out there, thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We hope this episode has made you curious and maybe inspired you to keep exploring these big questions about secession, self-determination, and the future of our world.
Remember, learning is better together, so keep asking those hard questions. Challenge what you think you know and have those deep conversations. You never know what you might discover.
Until next time, keep diving deep.